Good afternoon once again to those of you who are joining us on the Parliament channel. We're just about to begin a press conference by members of the public, the PAAC, which is the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee. 4 members of the committee are seated in the J. Hamilton Maurice Room. The chairman of the committee and the Speaker of the House, Member Bridget Anissa George, is about to begin. Seems to be a slight delay. In the meantime, the committee has laid a report, and the members of the committee will be discussing some of the findings and recommendations of those reports. Reports, of course, are on the Parliament's website, and so we're just awaiting a cue from the J. Hamilton Maurice Room, at which point the press conference will begin.
Good afternoon to all viewers on Parliament Channel 11 and on Parliament Radio 105.5 FM. We welcome all, including all members of the media, to this press conference being put on by the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee. The purpose of the press conference is to update the members of the public on the findings of a report of the committee into the current expenditure of ministries and departments under 3 subheads. They are current transfers and subsidies, development program consolidated fund, and infrastructure development fund. With us today, we have the four members of the community. I'll begin with the chairman of the committee, that is Mrs. Bridget Anissa George. To the chairman's right is the vice chairman, Dr. Lakram Bodo. To the vice chairman's right is Mrs. Ayana Webster Roy. And to the chairman's left is Mr. Wade Mark. At this time, I would hand over to the chairman of the committee to update the media and the public.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilshire. Good afternoon to the media, to my fellow committee members, and to the listening public. I am Bridget Anissa George, the Speaker of the House and Chairman of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee. The committee is mandated to consider and to report to Parliament on A, the budgetary expenditure of government agencies to ensure that expenditure is embarked upon in accordance with parliamentary approval. B, the budgetary expenditure of government agencies as it occurs, and to keep Parliament informed of the manner in which the budget allocation is being implemented. And C, the administration of government agencies to determine hindrances to their efficiency and to make recommendations to the government for improvement of public administration. In the first session of the 11th Parliament, the committee monitored the implementation of the budget and focused on the control mechanisms for expenditure under 3 subheads: current transfers and subsidies, development program consolidated fund, and infrastructure development fund. The objective of the committee's inquiry was to determine whether there was accountability, transparency, and value for money in the use of public funds under those 3 heads. The public hearings were held. There were 11 ministries and departments who were considered at the public hearings, and there were 4 site visits. The 11 entities examined in public by the PAAC were the Ministry of Sport and Youth Affairs, Industrial Court, Tax Appeal Board, Environmental Commission, Integrity Commission, Ministry of Public Utilities, Office of the Prime Minister, Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, Personnel Department, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Tourism. The 4 site visits conducted by the committee were at the following places: 1, National Aquatic Center; 2, the Cycling Velodrome, Trinidad Generation Unlimited, and the Couva Children's and Adult Hospital. Emanating from the committee's examinations, there were certain pervasive issues which the committee identified, and they were as follows: internal audit, fraud, monitoring and evaluation, exclusion of projects from the PSIP, project management, non-profit institutions, sub-accounting units in small departments, and finally, the communication backbone. The committee also identified specific issues related to individual ministries and departments, and these specific issues can be found in the committee's report. This report has been circulated to the media and is available on the Parliament's website, which is www.ttparliament.org. And therefore now I invite the media to pose any questions which they would like to get further elucidated.
Before the media poses questions, we'd like to ask you all to please identify yourselves and the media house which you represent, and then you can pose your question. Thank you.
Richard Lord, Guardian Media Limited. Madam Chair, what would you say were some of the major findings of your work so far that would be of concern to the national community?
Okay, so that in terms of what the committee had done, and just for me to build context, there were 41 heads. The committee found that 32 of the 41 heads were in receipt of allocations under current transfers and subsidies development program and the infrastructural fund, development program consolidated fund. We've found that in terms of looking at these 32 entities, there were certain pervasive issues. For instance, we found that when we looked at the internal audit function, in many cases they were non-existent. Where they were existent, they were either understaffed or didn't have the capacity to do the risk evaluation. We also found that in many of the instances that the ministries and departments weren't equipped with processes for distinguishing errors from fraud. We also found that the monitoring and evaluation function was either non-existent or not properly understood or carried out by the ministries. Another thing that we found that was very pervasive is that in the call circular issued by the Ministry of Finance, there is a clear prohibition about projects being carried over for an extended period of time. A project is supposed to have a life. And we found particularly in areas like computerization, projects were continued under the PSIP for over and above the period, the stipulated period of the 1 year. So those are the kinds of pervasive issues that we found that existed.
Any idea as to how these issues could be addressed in the near future?
Well, what the committee did is the committee made recommendations with respect to the pervasive issues and also with respect to the specific issues that were found in specific ministries. These recommendations would have been contained in our report, which was tabled in both houses of the Parliament.
Have you found any specific issues with respect to fraud in your work so far that you could tell us about?
Well, in terms of when we looked at particular ministries, and unfortunately, Richard, I can't call any out, but as I said, it would be contained in the report. What we'd found is that there may have been instances of fraud in specific ministries. Some of them were reported to the police and there were action taken. But in terms of the ministries having some sort of clear guidance with how do you say this error is fraud, and it's not just maybe a simple error of recording information. There wasn't that. There wasn't a clear system of how do you treat with consequences of fraud within the ministries.
I don't know if I could ask Senator Mark to share any of his comments with us at this time.
What I would like to say is to follow up on what the chairman said is in the instance of our recommendation dealing with fraud that we found, as the chairman said, existed in some ministries, reports being made to the police, and not the ministry officials not being able to clearly make a distinction between an error, a mistake in recording of information, and a fraudulent act being committed. We recommended that the Ministry of Finance should develop and implement a clear policy where fraudulent activities can be identified to prevent fraud from occurring, and this policy should be applicable throughout ministries, across departments, including state enterprises and statutory authorities, and most importantly, there should be penalties associated with breaches of the policy as it relates to standards that all ministries, government departments, state enterprises, and statutory authorities ought and must uphold if we are to maintain what we call transparency, accountability, value for money, and general overall efficiency of the delivery of goods and services to the people of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago.
I apologize if this question was answered before. I did come in a bit late. Did you all have find anything in the current expenditures that concerned the committee in terms of how money was being spent in the ministries?
Could you tell us your name and what media?
Oh, I'm sorry. Soini Gray from CNMG.
Okay, I think it's important, again, to repeat the context. In terms of the scope of the inquiry of the committee, we just focused on 3 specific heads, which would have been current transfers and subsidies, the Consolidated Fund, and the Infrastructure Development Fund, so that our inquiry was really limited to that.
And I think if I may also add, one of the challenges that our committee faced was the time question. We didn't have the kind of time to drill down a little more deeply into these entities that came before us, because as you know, we meet once a fortnight, and that certainly is not going to be adequate, because if we are to examine all these entities, and there are scores of them, as the chairman outlined, we need to have more time to drill down and to better appreciate what is taking place. Because as you know, when the Parliament approves $60 billion for ministries and agencies of government to spend, it is the responsibility of this committee to monitor and to track those expenditures to ensure that monies are being spent as approved by the Parliament, and there are clear principles of accountability, transparency, and value for money.
Mr. Waitmark, do you have any recommendations on what is the appropriate time? Any suggestions on what you would like to see the appropriate time for the committee to meet?
That's a matter for the committee to address, but it is a recommendation and a finding that we have submitted to the Parliament as it relates to that constraint that we face. But as you know, many of our parliamentarians are not full-time. Many of them are part-time, and maybe that could be one of the reasons why we don't have sufficient time to deal with the people's business, particularly when you have billions and billions of dollars being expended by many ministries and state agencies and departments.
But I just want to add to that when it comes to the time constraint, and that's a real practical challenge. Apart from parliamentarians being part-time, we have to look at the fact that we have, 72 parliamentarians? We have about 14 committees, okay? We have the plenary that happens almost every week in the Senate and in the House. And when you divide the 14 committees of, say, 8, and in our case, 10, I think there are 2 committees of 10 members, and the others have 8 each. You understand that many times members sit on more than one committee, okay? And there are so many hours in the day. So, in terms of recommendations, while it is whether we are full-time or not may aid it, there's also a practical limitation in what we could do. And therefore, again, I think to elucidate a little more on a question you asked earlier, we then therefore tend to structure our inquiry in a particular way. So we're not really doing a microscopic examination of each ministry line by line item. We're more looking at, and in the last inquiry, more really looking at systems, the mechanisms for control, the mechanisms to ensure, as we say, accountability, transparency, and value for money. And therefore, getting a sort of broader perspective of systems or lack thereof, or non-compliance with. And therefore, it helps us in how do we manage the gap of our task, our constraints of time and numbers, and being able to fulfill our mandate.
If I may just point out as well, it's very important for us to recognize that this committee is the first parliament that this committee has been implemented. As you would recall, and you would know, that we've had the PAAC, which is a Public Accounts Committee, which examines expenditure in retrospect. And it really is this first session of this parliament is the first time that this committee is doing its work, examining ongoing expenditure. So it is a work in progress, and of course, as we go along, we'll be trying to fine-tune the methods of inquiry. I think that's very important for us to note.
I'm Camille Hunt from the Express newspaper. I'd like to know, so the report has been compiled. What's the next step? What measures are in place to ensure that the recommendations are followed?
I will invite Member Mark to answer that question.
Camille, what happens is the report having been tabled in the Parliament, under the standing orders of the both houses of Parliament, ministries and departments, through their ministers, have a 60-day period in which to respond in writing to the recommendations that were submitted to their respective ministries and departments by this committee. So they have within 60 days to submit their recommendations. So obviously when they respond to those recommendations in terms of how they are going to effect implementation of those recommendations, we will then receive their report. We will then examine, analyze, and engage in a program of continuous monitoring of the activities of that entity to ensure that the recommendations that they claim that they have implemented are being implemented, even to the extent of the committee deciding to recall that entity, that ministry, before it, so we can get, for instance, further clarification on the implementation of the recommendations. So that is where we go to ensure. So it is not you table a report and it just gather dust. The minister is compelled under the standing order to respond in writing to our recommendations within 60 days.
I think you all conducted some site visits, one being the Couva Hospital. Anybody care to comment on what that experience was when you all went?
If I may, yeah. Well, the site visits are always an option. The process that we engage in is we write the various entities and ask for submission. Then based on the submission, we have a public inquiry if required. And of course, a site visit is always an option to clarify for the details. It gives us the opportunity to see firsthand, so to speak, what exactly is happening in terms of the project. As the chairman mentioned, we did 4 site visits in the past year, one of which was the Couva Hospital. The Couva Hospital was chosen because, as you would have been aware, there were many issues in the public domain as to the status of the hospital. So the committee thought it would be appropriate to see firsthand, what was actually on site. It was quite an interesting exercise and quite a revelation for many members of the committee. And some of the findings, of course, would be in the report and the recommendations.
Are you able to give us,
1 minute, Richard. We have time for 2 more questions. So we'll take 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, just could you enlighten us as to what the experience was actually? We haven't had a chance to look at the report in detail. Maybe you could shed some light as to what you saw when you went there. What was the outcome?
Well, the committee found that, by and large, that the site was well advanced in terms of preparation and readiness. The committee was also able to see firsthand the kind of equipment that was already installed and available in the hospital. So as I say, it was very important for that exercise to have taken place.
Sorry, I'm seeing that you all recommended that the ministry needs to develop a strict maintenance plan for the Couva Hospital. Are you all in a position to assist the ministry to actually develop this maintenance plan for the hospital and the other sites that you visited?
That is not part of the remit of the committee per se.
Okay.
All right, we'll take 1 last question since that last one was so short, if there's any more. No? Okay. That means that we have come to the end of this media conference.
Just before we close, Mr. Wiltshire, I just want to take the opportunity on behalf of the committee to express publicly our gratitude to all the stakeholders who participated in the examination, those who provide, well, all of them, all the 32 ministries and departments would have provided oral answers, verbal written answers to our questionnaires, and those who came before us in the examination. Some of them were very lengthy, and we are grateful for the cooperation of the various stakeholders. And I look forward to the new session when we begin another rounds of inquiries into another aspect of our mandate, and for their continued cooperation. Thank you.
Well, at this time, we say thank you to you, all the members of the media, for coming to cover this press conference, and also thank you to the members of the public who are tuned in to us on Parliament Channel 11 and also on Parliament Radio 105.5 FM. At this time, we go back to our regular programming.
You're viewing the Parliament Channel